Jennifer Simmons never imagined that a single careless joke would end up rewriting the entire shape of her life. On a tired Friday afternoon, inside a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor, the 36-year-old CEO leaned back in her chair and let out a small, exhausted laugh that caught everyone off guard. Someone had teased her again about being married to her company instead of a husband, and instead of brushing it off the way she usually did, she said the words that would later feel like fate itself had been listening. "Whoever finds me a husband by Sunday," she said, "gets double their bonus." The room burst into laughter, the kind of laughter that comes from people who think they just witnessed their boss being human for once. Nobody took it seriously. Nobody except one man sitting quietly near the back of the room. A man whose laughter sounded the same as everyone else's, but whose eyes did not match it at all. By Sunday evening, the doorbell of her penthouse rang. Standing there was Jack Brooks, a single father who worked several floors below her in the engineering department, a man she barely noticed most days beyond a polite nod in the hallway. In his hand was a small ring box, and in his eyes was something far more serious than a joke. What he said next would crack open a heart that had been sealed shut for years, and nothing in Jennifer's carefully built world would ever be the same again. Jennifer Simmons had built an empire from nothing, climbing from an unpaid internship to the chief executive seat of a technology corporation worth billions of dollars, and the financial press had given her a nickname that followed her everywhere: the Ice Queen, a woman supposedly incapable of warmth, only capable of growth charts and quarterly projections. Her days bled into each other in an unbroken rhythm of board meetings, investor calls, contract negotiations, and long flights to cities she barely remembered visiting. Each one looking the same from inside an airport lounge at midnight. She lived alone in a penthouse on the 40th floor, a place so polished and quiet that her own footsteps echoed against the marble floors. And most nights she ate dinner standing at the kitchen island, scrolling through reports instead of sitting at the table built for 6 people who never came. Even her birthdays had become just another date on a calendar full of deadlines, and the last time anyone had truly celebrated her turning a year older, she could not quite remember. Her mother called every few weeks, always circling back to the same question, asking when Jennifer would finally settle down and give her grandchildren before it was too late. And Jennifer always answered the same way, telling her there simply was not enough time. One by one, her college friends had gotten married, had children, posted family photos from beach vacations, while Jennifer sat in boardrooms negotiating mergers worth more money than most of them would see in a lifetime, yet feeling poorer in some invisible way she could never quite explain to anyone, not even to herself. Her assistant, a woman named Karen, who had worked beside her for nearly 9 years, often joked gently that Jennifer's idea of romance was closing a deal before the other side could read the fine print. Jennifer always laughed along, yet privately, she wondered when exactly she had stopped believing romance was something that happened to people like her, women who had clawed their way up from nothing and learned early that trust was the most expensive currency of all. She had been engaged once, years earlier, to a man who eventually admitted he was more interested in the company she was building than in the woman building it. And the wound from that discovery had never fully closed, no matter how many successful years passed afterward. Since then, she had quietly decided that loneliness, however uncomfortable, was at least predictable, and predictability felt safer than the risk of being fooled twice by the same kind of careless ambition disguised as affection. That Friday afternoon, after the laughter in the conference room had died down and people had filed out one by one, gathering their laptops and whispering jokes about who might actually try to win that imaginary bonus, only one man remained seated, a moment longer than necessary. Jack Brooks closed his folder slowly, smiled at the joke the way everyone else had. Yet something in his chest had shifted the second those words left her mouth. He had spent 2 years watching this woman work herself into exhaustion behind a closed office door, watching the quiet sadness she thought nobody noticed. And that joke, however small, lit something inside him that he had buried since the day his wife passed away. Jack Brooks was 38 years old, a man whose life had been rebuilt twice from the ground up, first when cancer took his wife 5 years earlier, and again when he became the sole parent to their daughter Emma, who was then only 3 years old. He led the technical engineering team at the company, respected by everyone who worked alongside him, known for staying late not because anyone demanded it, but because he genuinely cared whether the systems held together for the people depending on them. He was not wealthy, did not own a single share of company stock, drove a car with more than 100,000 miles on it. Yet everyone who knew him agreed on one thing, that Jack Brooks was the kind of man who showed up, every single time, without needing to be asked twice. His wife, Olivia, had been a kindergarten teacher with a laugh loud enough to fill every room she entered. And the years after her passing had taught Jack a kind of quiet discipline most people never had to learn. He woke before sunrise to make Emma's lunch, dropped her off at school before driving across town to the office, and somehow still managed to arrive early enough to review the overnight system logs before anyone else clocked in. His coworkers often asked how he managed it all without complaint, and Jack would simply shrug, saying that Olivia had taught him patience was not something you waited for, but something you practiced daily, like a muscle that needed exercise to stay strong. He kept a small photograph of her tucked into his work badge, hidden from view but always close. A quiet reminder that grief and gratitude could exist in the same heart, without canceling each other out. Late at night, when the office had emptied out and only the executive floor lights remained on, Jack would often find an excuse to walk past Jennifer's office, sometimes leaving a cup of coffee on her desk without saying a word, knowing she would never ask who left it there. More than once, he had quietly fixed a system error in the middle of the night before she even woke up to discover it, sparing her the panic of explaining a failure to investors who had little patience for excuses. One evening, working late on a server migration, he passed her office and saw her asleep at her desk, head resting on a stack of contracts. The city lights outside the window, the only thing watching over her. He did not wake her. He simply draped his own jacket over her shoulders and quietly closed the door behind him, telling himself it meant nothing, even though some part of him knew it meant everything. There was another evening, months before any of this began, when Jennifer's flight home from an overseas conference was delayed for nearly 9 hours, and she returned to the office, exhausted and irritable, snapping at a junior analyst over a minor scheduling mistake before catching herself and apologizing immediately afterward. Jack happened to be nearby, and instead of judging her the way some colleagues quietly did behind closed doors, he simply brought her a cup of tea and mentioned, almost casually, that even the strongest systems needed scheduled downtime to keep running properly. Jennifer had looked up at him then, surprised by the small kindness, and thanked him in a tone that suggested she was not used to anyone noticing when she needed rest rather than results. Another night, he happened to be in the parking garage when he saw her sitting alone in her car, phone pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face after a call with her mother that had clearly gone wrong. He did not approach her, did not let her know he had seen, but he sat in his own car for nearly 20 minutes afterward, unable to drive home, thinking about how strange it was that a woman who controlled an empire could feel so utterly alone inside it. Jack began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that behind the composed expression Jennifer wore into every meeting was a woman carrying loneliness the size of the very company she had built. And when she made that joke about finding a husband by Sunday, something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the only window he would ever get. At home that same evening, Emma Brooks, 8 years old and far too perceptive for her age, scrolled through her father's phone while waiting for dinner to finish cooking, the way children do when curiosity gets the better of patience. She stopped on a photograph of Jennifer from a company event months earlier, a candid shot Jack had taken without quite admitting to himself why he kept it. Emma held up the phone with a grin stretching across her face, asking her father in the most direct way only a child could manage, whether he had a crush on his boss. Jack nearly dropped the spoon he was holding, his ears turning red as he fumbled for an answer that never quite came out right. Emma remembered Jennifer clearly from that company event. The woman in the elegant blue dress who had crouched down to Emma's height instead of talking over her head the way most adults did, asking her what her favorite subject in school was and actually listening to the answer. Jennifer had told her that science was important because it helped people fix things that seemed unfixable. And Emma had carried those words with her ever since, repeating them sometimes when her homework felt too hard. To an 8-year-old, that single moment of attention meant more than any title or any amount of wealth ever could. And from that day forward, Emma decided she liked Jennifer Simmons very much. Sitting at the kitchen table that night, Emma asked her father plainly why he never simply told Jennifer how he felt, if he liked her so much. Jack sighed, setting down his fork, telling his daughter gently that Jennifer lived in an entirely different world from theirs, a world of company jets and shareholder meetings, far removed from school pickup lines and grocery store budgets. Emma considered this for a moment, the way children consider things with surprising clarity, and then she said something that stopped her father completely. She told him that her mother used to say good people always belonged in the same world, no matter how different their lives looked from the outside. Jack sat there in silence, staring at his daughter, wondering when she had grown wise enough to remind him of the very thing he had forgotten how to believe. A few days later, Emma brought up the subject again while they were grocery shopping, pushing the cart down the cereal aisle and asking, with the bluntness only a child could manage, whether grown-ups were simply afraid of things that scared them, the same way she used to be afraid of the dark before she got her nightlight. Jack laughed despite himself, admitting that, yes, sometimes grown-ups were exactly that afraid, even when the fear made no logical sense at all. Emma nodded seriously, as though she had just confirmed a long-held theory, and told him that maybe he just needed a nightlight of his own. Something small that reminded him it was safe to feel hopeful again. Jack reached over and ruffled her hair, telling her she had inherited her mother's gift for saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, and Emma beamed with pride the rest of the afternoon. The following week, a critical business deal threatened to collapse entirely. A partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars suddenly jeopardized by a technical failure nobody had anticipated. Jennifer found herself working through an entire weekend for the first time in years, and so did Jack, both of them trapped in the same building, fighting the same fire, side by side in a way their normal schedules never allowed. Late on Saturday night, with the crisis finally calming down, they ordered pizza because neither of them had eaten anything substantial in over 12 hours. And they ate it sitting on the floor of the empty office, laughing about nothing in particular for the first time and longer than either of them wanted to admit. Afterward, they took the elevator to the rooftop terrace, looking out over a city glittering beneath them. And for once, Jennifer did not check her phone every few minutes the way she normally did. She told him, almost involuntarily, about growing up in a small house with a leaking roof, about her father losing his job twice before she turned 15, about studying by flashlight, because the electricity bill always seemed to come due before the paycheck did. Jack listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her about his wife, about the laughter that used to fill their small apartment, about the silence that replaced it the day the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Standing there with the wind pulling at her hair, Jennifer admitted something she had never said aloud to anyone, that she honestly could not remember the last time she had felt truly happy, not accomplished, not successful, but happy in the simple, uncomplicated way people seem to mean when they used that word. Jack looked at her for a long moment, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, and he did not offer some clever response or attempt to fix her sadness the way executives around her usually tried to do. He simply stayed there beside her in silence. And somehow that silence said more than any words could have. And Jennifer found herself wondering, just for a moment, what it might feel like to not be alone. Before they finally went their separate ways that night, Jack asked her a question nobody at the company had ever bothered asking, what she would do with an entire free Saturday if work simply did not exist. Jennifer laughed at first, saying she genuinely had no idea, since she could not remember the last time such a day had even been possible. After a long pause, she admitted quietly that she used to love painting as a teenager, cheap watercolors on cardboard, because real canvas was too expensive, and that she had not picked up a brush in over 15 years. Jack told her that sounded like exactly the kind of thing worth remembering how to do again. And something about the gentle way he said it made her chest ache with a feeling she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Before that weekend ever began, Jennifer had spent years convincing herself that loneliness was simply the cost of ambition, a fair trade for everything she had built since leaving her parents' small house, with nothing but a scholarship letter and a single suitcase. She remembered being 19 years old, standing in a university hallway, promising herself that one day nobody would ever again look at her family the way people once looked at them, with pity disguised as politeness. That promise had carried her through business school, through sleepless years founding her first small startup, through the long climb to the corner office she now occupied. Yet somewhere along the way, the promise had quietly swallowed every other part of her life. She had not noticed the trade happening in real time, only realizing its full weight on nights like the one spent on that rooftop, when laughter with another human being felt almost foreign after years of practiced solitude. For 2 full days after that weekend, Jack could think of little else besides the woman he had spent 12 straight hours beside, fixing servers and eating cold pizza and watching a city light up beneath them. He knew the odds of anything coming from it were close to nothing. Knew that men in his position did not simply walk up to women in her position and expect anything but rejection or ridicule. His closest friend told him outright that he had lost his mind, that pursuing his own boss, a woman worth more money than entire countries, was a fast way to lose his job and embarrass himself in the process. A few co-workers who somehow caught wind of his lingering feelings made quiet jokes behind his back, calling him delusional, calling it the kind of fantasy men told themselves to feel important. His friend Marcus, who had known him since college, sat across from him at a diner one evening and tried a different approach, asking him plainly what exactly he expected to happen if he actually went through with it. Jack admitted he had no real plan beyond telling the truth, no strategy for handling the inevitable gossip or the awkward Monday morning that would follow regardless of her answer. Marcus shook his head, half amused and half worried, telling him that most men would call that reckless. But then again, most men had never watched their wife fight a disease for 2 years, only to lose anyway, and maybe that kind of loss changed what a person considered worth risking. Jack stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering, saying that Olivia had taught him life was too short to spend it, being careful with feelings that mattered, and silence, however safe it felt, had never once made anyone happy in the end. But Jack kept circling back to one memory, the box he had kept hidden in the top drawer of his dresser for over 6 years, a small ring he had purchased for his wife before the illness took its terrible final turn, a ring she never lived long enough to wear. He had told himself for years that he would never open that drawer again, that whatever future it represented had died alongside her. Yet now, holding it in his palm on a quiet Tuesday evening after Emma had gone to bed, he felt something shift inside his chest, an old grief making room for something unexpected and entirely new. He sat at his kitchen table for nearly an hour, turning the small box over in his hands, weighing every reason this was a terrible idea against the single feeling that refused to leave him alone. Finally, he said the words out loud to an empty room, telling himself that if he never tried, he would spend the rest of his life wondering, and that kind of regret felt far heavier than any embarrassment Sunday night might bring. He decided, in that quiet kitchen, that some risks were worth taking even when every voice around him insisted otherwise, and for the first time in 5 years, Jack Brooks allowed himself to hope for something just for himself. Sunday evening arrived quietly, the kind of evening Jennifer usually spent reviewing reports with the television, playing unwatched in the background for company. She had almost forgotten if whatever would end, whatever plast whatever once. Whatever 114 the plasty, 114 the plast, disguised as humor. Sitting on her couch with a glass of wine she had barely touched, she found herself thinking, unprompted, about how strange her life had become. Successful by every measurable standard, yet somehow hollow in ways no spreadsheet could ever capture. The doorbell rang, startling her out of her thoughts, and she frowned slightly, since nobody ever visited her apartment unannounced on a Sunday night. She opened the door and found Jack Brooks standing in the hallway, dressed in a neatly pressed suit that looked nothing like the casual clothes he usually wore around the office, his hands slightly trembling as he held a small velvet box. For a moment, Jennifer simply stared at him, certain she had misunderstood something, certain there must be some company emergency requiring his sudden appearance at her door. Jack took a slow breath, looked directly into her eyes, and told her that he had searched everywhere, yet had never once found a man more deserving of standing beside her than himself. Jennifer felt the air leave her lungs completely, her mind racing to catch up with what was happening right in front of her. He did not mention her wealth, did not mention her title, did not say a single word about the company or the empire she had built brick by brick over 15 exhausting years. Instead, he spoke about the woman he had watched quietly for 2 years. The one who left coffee cups half full because she got too absorbed in her work to remember drinking them, the one who cried alone in a parking garage after calls with her mother, the one who fell asleep over contracts because she refused to let anyone else carry her burdens. He told her that he saw her, not the headlines written about her, not the nickname the press had given her, but the actual woman underneath all of it, tired and lonely, and far braver than anyone around her ever gave her credit for being. He told her he was not asking because he had calculated some perfect outcome, because there was no version of this evening that made logical sense on paper, and he knew that better than anyone standing in her doorway uninvited on a Sunday night. He told her he was asking because for the first time since losing Olivia, he had found himself wanting to build a future with someone again, and that someone, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be her. He admitted he had rehearsed this moment a dozen different ways in his car outside her building. Yet none of those rehearsed speeches felt as true as simply standing here and telling her plainly that he loved who she was, not what she had, and that he would understand completely if she needed time, or if her answer was no at all. Jennifer felt tears sliding down her face before she even realized she had started crying, something she rarely allowed herself to do in front of anyone, let alone a near stranger standing in her doorway with his heart laid completely bare. She had been proposed to once before, years earlier, by a man more interested in the company she would eventually inherit than in the woman holding it together. This felt entirely different. This felt like someone finally looking past every accomplishment she had stacked up like armor, and choosing, simply, to see her. She did not say yes that night, and she did not say no either. But she invited him inside, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Jennifer Simmons let someone witness her exactly as she was. News of what happened that Sunday night spread through the company faster than either of them anticipated. Whispered first between assistants, then between department heads, until eventually it reached the boardroom itself. Several members of the board expressed immediate concern, worried about how the press might portray a CEO entangled romantically with an employee several levels beneath her on the corporate ladder. Financial commentators picked up the story within days, framing it less as a love story and more as a scandal, questioning Jennifer's judgment, questioning whether personal feelings might compromise her leadership during a critical period for the company. A prominent business magazine ran a feature within the week, complete with an unflattering headline questioning whether romance had clouded the judgment of one of the industry's most respected executives. Television commentators debated the story on a midday business program. Two analysts, arguing for nearly 10 minutes about whether a chief executive's personal life should ever factor into investor confidence at all. Inside the office itself, the atmosphere shifted noticeably, conversations dropping to whispers whenever Jennifer or Jack walked past. Colleagues who once greeted Jack warmly, now offering only stiff, uncertain nods in the hallway. Even Karen, Jennifer's loyal assistant, found herself fielding an unusual number of phone calls from reporters asking pointed questions about the nature of the relationship, questions she deflected with practiced patience, while privately worrying about what the pressure might eventually do to her boss. The criticism grew harsher with each passing day, strangers and acquaintances alike speculating publicly about Jack's true motives, suggesting he had calculated this entire pursuit as a shortcut to wealth he could never otherwise achieve. Some claimed an engineer simply did not belong beside a chief executive, framing the entire relationship as a fairy tale built on financial opportunism rather than genuine affection. Adding fuel to an already difficult situation, Jennifer's former boyfriend, from years earlier, resurfaced unexpectedly. Reaching out under the guise of concern, hinting that he had always regretted letting her go, and implying that Jack was nothing more than a passing distraction beneath her actual worth. Her former boyfriend, a man named Richard, who had once run his own investment firm, invited her to lunch under the pretense of discussing an old mutual business contact, then spent most of the meal questioning her judgment instead. He told her, in a tone dressed up as concern, that he understood the appeal of someone simple and uncomplicated after years of dealing with men who only wanted her for her position, but that eventually the novelty would fade, and she would realize Jack could never truly understand the pressures of running an empire, the way someone in her own world could. Jennifer sat there quietly, picking at a salad she had no appetite for, recognizing the same condescension that had ended their relationship years earlier, dressed up now in slightly kinder language. She left that lunch early, telling him she had a meeting to attend, though the real meeting she needed was with her own conscience. The cruelest comments stung the most precisely because they echoed doubts Jennifer had not even realized she carried within herself. People said Jack only wanted her money, that he saw an opportunity in her loneliness and seized it with calculated patience, that no man working an entry-level technical position could possibly love a woman like her for reasons unrelated to her bank account. Jennifer found herself lying awake at night, staring at her ceiling, wondering if perhaps the world understood something about Jack that she had somehow missed in her own desperate hunger for connection. The doubt crept in slowly at first, then settled deeper with every headline, every whispered comment from colleagues who suddenly treated her differently in meetings. Jack noticed the shift in her almost immediately, the hesitation in her voice during their phone calls, the distance creeping into conversations that used to feel effortless between them. Rather than fighting to hold on, rather than pleading his case the way pride might have demanded, Jack made a decision that broke his own heart in the process. He quietly stepped back from her life, telling her he understood the pressure she faced and did not want to become another burden added to an already impossible situation, even though every part of him wanted nothing more than to stay exactly where he was. That night, after ending the call where he told her he would give her space, Jack sat in Emma's doorway watching his daughter sleep, wondering if he had made a mistake by ever knocking on that penthouse door in the first place. Emma stirred slightly and murmured, half asleep, asking if Jennifer was coming over for dinner soon the way she sometimes did. Jack told her softly that things had gotten complicated, and Emma, even in her drowsy state, frowned and said that complicated things just needed more patience, not giving up, before drifting back to sleep without waiting for his answer. Jack sat there a long while after that, turning his daughter's sleepy wisdom over in his mind, unsure whether to believe an 8-year-old's optimism or the harsh realities the adult world kept insisting on reminding him of every single day. The company crisis Jennifer had feared eventually arrived in full force, triggered partly by the public distraction surrounding her personal life and partly by genuine market instability that had nothing to do with romance at all. Investor confidence wavered, share prices dropped sharply over the course of 2 difficult weeks, and the board convened an emergency meeting demanding explanations for what they called a serious lapse in professional judgment. Jennifer sat through hours of tense questioning, watching men who had supported her for years suddenly question whether she could separate her personal choices from her professional responsibilities. During one particularly tense board session, an older member delivered something close to an ultimatum, suggesting Jennifer needed to choose decisively between maintaining her position as chief executive or continuing whatever relationship had developed with an employee far beneath her on the organizational chart. The implication hung in the air clearly enough that nobody needed to spell it out further. That her career and her heart could not coexist in the same decision. Jennifer left that meeting feeling more exhausted than she had felt in years, uncertain which direction would cost her less in the end. That night, unable to sleep, she drove to the office alone, telling herself she simply needed to clear her head among the empty desks and quiet hallways that had always calmed her during difficult seasons of her career. Walking past the engineering department, dark and abandoned at that late hour, she noticed a light, still glowing faintly from one workstation, and her assistant Karen later explained that the light belonged to Jack's terminal, left logged in from earlier that day. Out of habit more than curiosity, Jennifer sat down at the desk, intending only to shut down the monitor, but instead found herself staring at a folder of time-stamped maintenance logs spanning the past 3 years. It was during this difficult stretch that something unexpected surfaced, something that would shift the entire narrative surrounding Jack Brooks once and for all. While reviewing old project files during an unrelated audit, Jennifer's assistant discovered documentation revealing that Jack had quietly resolved several critical system failures over the past 3 years. Failures that could have cost the company enormous financial losses and irreparable damage to client trust. He had never filed for recognition, never mentioned these contributions in performance reviews, never once used them to negotiate a raise or a promotion he clearly deserved. Jennifer sat alone in her office that evening, staring at the timestamps on server logs that confirmed dates and times when Jack had stayed until 3 in the morning, fixing problems that bore no name attached except his own quiet diligence. One entry in particular caught her attention, dated the same week as a major product launch 2 years earlier. A week she remembered clearly because the company had announced record-breaking sales without a single technical hiccup reported anywhere in the press. She had praised her entire team publicly for that flawless launch, never once realizing that one man had spent 4 consecutive nights without sleep ensuring nothing broke, then walked into the celebration the following week, applauding alongside everyone else, as though he had done nothing extraordinary at all. She remembered every cruel comment people had thrown at him, every accusation that he wanted nothing but money and status, and she felt something close to shame for ever allowing those voices to plant doubt inside her own heart. The man everyone accused of chasing wealth had spent years protecting a company that did not even know it owed him anything, asking for nothing in return except the simple chance to do his job well. The company's annual shareholder meeting arrived 3 weeks later, the largest gathering of investors and board members the company hosted each year, traditionally focused entirely on financial performance and future strategy. Jennifer walked onto the stage that morning with a different speech prepared than the one her communications team had drafted for her, one she had written alone, late the night before, after finally understanding exactly what she needed to say. Standing before hundreds of investors and board members, Jennifer told the room that people in this very building had spent weeks evaluating a man by nothing more than his job title, treating his worth as something measurable purely by salary and rank. She told them she evaluated him differently, by his character, by the quiet years he spent protecting a company that never knew his name, by the patient way he raised a daughter alone, while never once complaining about how heavy that burden truly was. She told the room a number, the figure printed at the bottom of one server incident report from 2 years earlier, the projected financial loss the company would have absorbed had that particular failure gone unresolved before the morning trading session opened. She watched several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats as she read it aloud, the same number they had once celebrated in a quarterly earnings call, without ever asking who had quietly prevented the disaster behind the scenes. She told them that leadership was not only measured by the decisions made in this very room, but also by the unseen sacrifices made in server rooms and late-night offices by people whose names rarely appeared on any organizational chart worth mentioning. She revealed, slowly and deliberately, the contributions Jack had made over the years without ever seeking credit, watching the surprise ripple visibly across the faces of board members who had questioned her judgment only weeks earlier. She called him the most courageous man she had ever encountered, not because he pursued her despite the obvious risks, but because he had spent years quietly doing the right thing, even when nobody was watching to reward him for it. Then, in front of every camera and every skeptical board member present, Jennifer reached out and took Jack's hand, who had been standing quietly near the side of the stage at her request. The room fell into a stunned silence for several long seconds, the kind of silence that feels like it could shatter at any moment. And then, slowly at first, people began to rise from their seats, applause building until it filled the entire hall. Board members included, the same men who had demanded she choose now, witnessing exactly what that choice looked like. Near the back of the room, the same older board member who had issued the ultimatum weeks earlier stood slowly, clapping along with everyone else, and later that afternoon, he approached Jennifer privately to admit he had judged the situation too quickly, that watching her speak with such conviction had reminded him why the company trusted her leadership in the first place. He extended his hand toward Jack as well, offering a brief but sincere apology for the assumptions he had allowed himself to make, and Jack accepted the gesture graciously, understanding that changed minds mattered more than perfect timing ever could. 1 year later, Life had settled into something neither Jennifer nor Jack had ever quite dared to imagine for themselves. Jennifer remained chief executive, having weathered the storm with her reputation not only intact but somehow strengthened by the honesty she had shown when it mattered most. Jack had been promoted to head the entire engineering division, a promotion earned entirely through the years of quiet competence everyone had finally taken the time to notice and acknowledge properly. They had built a life together gradually, moving into a house with a backyard large enough for Emma to plant the small vegetable garden she had been begging her father for since she was 6 years old. Jennifer learned to cook simple meals on weekends, something she had never bothered learning during her years of solitary takeout dinners, and Jack learned to navigate boardroom dynamics with the quiet confidence that came from finally being seen for who he truly was. On Sunday mornings, the three of them had developed a small ritual of walking to the farmer's market, a few blocks from their new home, Emma always insisting on choosing the strawberries herself because she claimed she had a special talent for picking the sweetest ones. Jennifer, who once would have filled that same Sunday morning with conference calls and quarterly forecasts, found herself looking forward to nothing more complicated than the smell of fresh bread and the sound of Emma negotiating with the same vendor each week over the price of blueberries. Jack often caught Jennifer smiling quietly during these mornings, a kind of smile that had nothing to do with closing a deal or beating a competitor, simply the smile of someone who had remembered, finally, what it felt like to be unhurried. One evening, Emma stood in front of her bathroom mirror rehearsing a speech for a school assignment about what family meant to her, and Jennifer happened to pass by the open door, pausing to listen without meaning to intrude. Emma's voice carried clearly into the hallway as she practiced her closing line, saying that she used to think family meant the people who happened to give birth to you, but now she understood family meant the people who chose, again and again, to stay. Jennifer stood frozen in that hallway, tears welling up before she could stop them, overwhelmed by words spoken so simply by a child who had somehow understood something it took Jennifer 37 years to fully grasp. She walked into the room and hugged Emma tightly, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking completely. And Emma hugged her back without needing any explanation for why. That same evening, the three of them gathered around the kitchen table for dinner. No laptops open beside their plates, no urgent phone calls interrupting the meal, no looming deadlines pressing against the edges of conversation. Jennifer looked across the table at Jack, patiently helping Emma with a particularly stubborn math problem. His sleeves rolled up, his attention completely devoted to a child who was not even biologically his own, yet loved as deeply as if she had been. Emma looked up partway through dinner and asked, with the same bluntness she had used the day she first discovered Jennifer's photo on her father's phone, whether Jennifer thought their family was strange compared to other families at school. Jennifer set down her fork and considered the question seriously, telling Emma that every family looked strange from the outside until you understood the love holding it together, and that the families worth having were rarely the ones that looked perfect in photographs. Emma nodded thoughtfully, satisfied with the answer, then immediately returned to negotiating for a second helping of dessert, the seriousness of the moment dissolving into laughter the way only a child could manage so effortlessly. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Jennifer understood something about success that no business school had ever taught her, that building an empire worth billions of dollars meant absolutely nothing if there was no one waiting at home to share an ordinary Tuesday evening with her. The greatest achievement of her entire life was not the company bearing her name on every building entrance, but the home she now returned to each night, filled with warmth no amount of money could ever have purchased on its own. Later that night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep, Jennifer sat on the couch beside Jack, resting her head gently against his shoulder, watching warm light spill softly through the living room window onto the quiet street outside. Neither of them said much, because neither of them needed to anymore, the silence between them finally meaning everything good instead of everything missing. Somewhere down the hallway, Emma slept soundly in a room covered with drawings of gardens and stars, unaware that her simple words earlier that evening had finally taught her father's wife exactly what home was supposed to feel like.